Welcome back. In this session, we're going to be looking at Postman. We're going to look at how it's used in order to test APIs, how you would set it up, how tokens work with regards to APIs and gaining access to APIs, and just generally how you would use Postman in order to facilitate the testing of APIs. So let's jump straight in and see what it's all about. So how can Postman be used to test an API? Well, before we jump into using Postman, you first need to understand some of the core concepts and terminology that's generally used around APIs. So the first of these are request methods. So request methods can consist of a get, which is around returning data. You can then have a post, which is generally around creating a resource. And by resource, if you're calling an endpoint for creating an order, that would be an order. You can then do things like delete. So that would be removing data. And there are various other request methods as well, which I've also covered in a previous video. I'll add the link above, but we need to just make sure that we understand these concepts before we jump directly into using Postman. So we've got request methods. Second, we've got things around the data. And what I mean by that is when you're calling an API, there are different ways to provide that data. The first is in a header. Now a header is all around key value pairs. And what do I mean by that? Well, it could be that you've got a header called shoe size. And then within that, that would be the name of the header, and the value could then potentially be 12. And you've got various different ways of providing that data for various reasons. You might have an API key and things like that, but a header is a place where you can provide some of that data. Now, similar to headers, you have your query parameters. Now, query parameters you've probably seen quite often within the web and different APIs and URLs. So when we're talking about query parameters, if you've got some kind of a HTTP, yes, there we go, we'll create an address here, then you might then have your main URL, and then for instance, you might see this at the end. Now, very similar to the headers, what this is doing is it's again creating key value pairs. So here we're providing a category with a value of shoes, a color with a value of blue, and a size value of 9. So that's another way that we can potentially provide data. On top of that, we've then got the body or formerly the payload. So if you were calling an API and you had to send a whole load of maybe XML or more commonly JSON, the body would be where you would place that data. And then the various elements around that, you might have an ID referencing for a shoe, for instance. All the details around the data would be stored in the payload, but you may well provide the key identifier for that particular item as a query parameter or maybe as a header value. Again, it all depends on the documentation that you'll be provided with, and that we'll be looking at fairly shortly as well. And then another data element is basically around authorization. So you've got different things with authorization. We'll be looking in this session predominantly around tokens and JWT tokens. And this is all around the fact that in order to access an API, you need to be authorized to do so. And in doing that, there are various ways to get that authorization or that token in this case. So this is request methods. You then have the data. Finally, you then have a very key element, which is around response codes. Now, response codes are what you get in response to submitting your request with your data. Now here, you can get various different codes. Anything that is between 200 and 299 is a successful API call. Now, generally, a generic one would be 200. 201, I believe, is, you've successfully created a record, etc. But anything in the 200 range is a success. You then have 400 errors. So again, between 400 and 499, you'll have errors, and these are generally related to client errors. And what we mean by client errors, we mean the user. So if you're calling an API, you're doing a GET request or whatever, and you get a 400 back, you are, as the user or the system, you're at fault. So either you haven't provided something, for instance, you might not have provided the authorization token, in which case you would get a 401, which is a error related to authorization. It may well be you've provided the wrong payload, so you might get some errors around that. But generally, it's to do with what you've sent and how you've configured your API call, in this case within Postman. And then finally, you've got 500 errors. So anything between 500 and 599, these are all considered server errors. So if you were calling an API and you got a 500 return response code, then generally speaking, there is something wrong on the server side. That could be that the service is down, there's some kind of error, something along those lines. It's not generally considered anything to do with the payload that's being sent by yourself using Postman or the calling system. So now we understand this, what I just quickly want to do is paint a picture on how you would use an API when it comes to authorization. So during this session, we're going to be using a pet store API, which is all around getting data around a literal pet store. What we need to understand is we've got our Postman application, which we're using in order to test our API. And we need to understand how that works in relation to a token and authorization. So if we've got an API that's using tokens, then if we go from Postman or any application and we try and do a call to that API, we will get a 401, generally speaking. So you're going to get a 400 error around the fact that you're not authorized. You're not providing a valid token. So what you need to do is when you're provided with an API, you'll be provided with the token endpoint. And what you'll do is you'll call that endpoint before you call the API, in this case, the pet store API. And what you're going to be sending here is there's going to be some sort of a client secret. So you're sending some values as part of that call. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to number these so it's really clear. So we're going to call that. And on the basis of that being successful, in response to that, we're then going to be provided with a token. And that token will contain the details we need in order to pass that back to the API that we're going to be calling next. So we're going to get our token coming back here. So got our token. Using that token then, we can provide that to our pet store API. So if we were going to do a call to this, and it doesn't really matter whether this call is a GET request, a POST, a delete, what you're basically going to have is you're going to have your sort of standard payload. And in addition to that, you're going to have your token value. And what happens is when that API receives that, it will validate the token. And on the basis that that token is valid, then in response, you will get the response back to your API call. So from here, very simply, you'll have your call going back. And that then will contain the response codes and the payload, if there is one, for that request. So if you're updating records, it might just be 200 and that's it. If you're doing a GET request, this could be a list of pets, etc., and details related to that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a pet API, pet store API, and how you would use Postman in order to call that API. We'll also cover the use of tokens and how that works, what you need to do, what kind of response you can expect, what methods of HTTP methods you'll be using. So when you're requesting a secret, it's always a POST, generally speaking. But again, the documentation that you are provided via the technical department will kind of explain how that works. And again, the documentation here generally is fairly straightforward. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull on screen the Swagger for our pet store API. And this will make it really easy for any non-technical users to understand exactly what's going on and what they can expect. So here we have documentation around a pet store API. And this is provided as a Swagger. So some of you may have seen this before, some of you might not, but it's fairly straightforward. So here you've got your different methods that are provided. So your request methods, and you can quite simply click on here and it describes exactly what you're meant to provide through. So this API has got a kind of root URL that you'll be provided by the development team or the documentation. So you can see it's on here. And then you can provide the various elements that are required in order to test this. So we can hit try it out. And again, this isn't using Postman. This is using the document Swagger in order to test this. So we can actually provide sort of an ID number, any additional information, upload an image in this case, or provide an image. Again, it's not really uploading it, it's forming it as part of that payload. And then you can actually hit execute and complete that. Now, obviously, if you don't fill out certain things that are expected, in this case, this is required, the metadata, we're going to have some errors. So let's go down to one that is more straightforward. So if we're talking around the pet store, we've got a inventory here. So it returns pet inventories by status. So here we can hit try this out and we can hit execute. There's nothing really to pass. This is just a very straightforward get call. And here we can see the response we'd get back. So this is the response payload. This is the response code. It's a 200 and it's successful. And it's as simple as that. And then you do get some response headers coming back, which may or may not be useful as part of the API implementation that you're doing. Here we can see we've got the request URL. So that is the URL we're calling using a GET request. And it's fairly straightforward. So what I want to do now is I'm going to pull up Postman. We're going to use the information that we've got here in order to set Postman up in order to do a GET request to this pet store. Now, this particular pet store is just available online as kind of a demonstration of how documentation works from a Swagger perspective. This doesn't implement anything around sort of tokens, and I'll get to that shortly so we can see how that actually works within Postman. Because again, most APIs that people will be using and testing will have some kind of authentication around it, whether that's an API key that has to be stored in a header that is per user, or whether they're using some sort of OAuth piece there in order to get tokens, etc. So let's now pull up our Postman and see what information we want to provide in order to call this API, not from a web page, but from within Postman, the application itself. So here is our Postman application. Now I've got various different collections here storing various different API endpoints and requests that I've been using over a period of time. What you can do from within Postman is you can actually export a collection, and in doing that you can then provide that to somebody in order to basically give it to them so they can import it into Postman in order to use. And your technical person will likely be able to provide that, or even the API provider can give you that, so you haven't got to go through the manual process. However, the manual process we're going to go through now is really useful in order to understand how Postman really works. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new collection, and a collection is just a way of grouping request templates. So we're going to create a blank collection. We're going to call this Pet Store Test. And it's as simple as that. And from within here, we can now create a new request. Every request has a request method. So we're going to have a GET request here. We then need the URL. So what we can do is we can grab the URL that we have got provided in the documentation for the inventory. So we can do that. We can then go back to our Postman. We can paste that in and we can do some testing around that. So let's just hit send and see what we get from here. So straight away we get a response. We're getting a 200, and again the response is shown here. We've then got our GET request and the various different data elements we were discussing previously on the sort of slides area there. So we've got parameters we can provide, query parameters. So again, key value pairs. We've got the same with our headers. So some of these headers are kind of standard. You can turn certain or activate certain ones on or off, or you can add your own if they're required. You then have a body. So if we were going to be sending JSON, we want to select raw and then select the JSON as the format. So if not, if you were sending XML, you would do the same with XML. And then you can do your send. So for the API that we're looking at the moment, this is really straightforward because we don't have anything we need to provide in the body. Now, if we go back up, it may well be that we need to do some more parameter passing if we're going to create information around a pet, for instance. So let's try this one. So what we can do now is we can grab this payload as an example, and then we can look at basically calling this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do a test within here and we can see what we'll get back. So we get a 200 response, and this again is posting. So it's going to be adding a new pet. So we can see this here to the /pet endpoint. And all that means is when we look down at the API endpoint we're calling, it's got the root call here with /pet. So pet is the interface that we're talking to. We're providing this payload, and then below is the response we got back, which is a 200 OK. So it's created that basically. So what we can do is we can look at configuring Postman and going through the steps on how we would do that. So we've got our get request here that we didn't name. So let's make this inventory, and then we can just save that. We can then on here, we can basically look at going back to our collection and go and add a new request. And here we're going to do a post. And then we've got our body. We want to set that to JSON. We want to chuck that in here. And then what we also need to grab is the endpoint URL. So we know it's the same, but it's /pet, so we can just grab that. And again, we're just using the standard documentation in order to do this. We can provide this in here, and now let's just hit send and see what happens. And there we go. So we've got 200 OK, and we've provided that payload. Now these are really simple and really easy endpoints. Now we've got one above here where there's certain extra information we need to provide. We can see this is still talking to the pet interface, but it's expected that we would provide an ID and then /an image. So we'd provide an image as part of that. Now, if we wanted to do that within Postman, what we'd then do is we'd have a separate one that we would create, new request, which would be about image. So this is kind of new pet. We can actually duplicate this if we want. And this could be pet image, new pet image. And we know we're going to pet, but again, we would then have to paste in whatever the pet number is. And then go back. You would then have upload image, /upload image, and then you'd need to provide upload image, the additional data here that is required. So the pet ID we're already providing, that's stated here as a path. So that's as part of the URL. There is then additional information and files that we would need, and then we could submit it and do that successfully. So again, it's really straightforward. If you're going to get any errors, so if we go back to Postman and we go back to our new pet, for instance, and we try and submit something that's invalid, let's just, for instance, copy that and delete a whole load of data out here, send this. We've got a 500 here, so we've actually caused that. It looks like it's a server side, but we know the payload here is not correct. So what we want to do here now is we need to understand that we've got an API that we can talk to. It's a very, very simple API. It doesn't have any authentication or anything like that. It's open, and that might be fine. And then there'll be things around sort of weather apps and things like that where you don't have to potentially get any kind of authorization to access it. But it may well be that you've got some sort of WMS API that is secured in such a way that it uses a token. And then you might go, well, how would we talk to that API? So if we use this as an example, we go back to our bit here. We've got this. We're going to test to make sure this is okay. So that's all working. Now, it may well be that we need to get a token. And if we need to provide a token, what we need to do is we need to be given what that token endpoint is, and then we need some additional information like the client's secret in order to request that particular token. So if I go back to Postman, what I've done is I've implemented a pet API on Azure. So it's exactly the same endpoints, the same swagger, but I'm hosting it and I've gone, I want only those users to get access if they've got a token. So what you would do in that instance is you'd have your token endpoint, which quite often ends /token. However, people can provide them however they want. You would then have various details to provide. So it is always the case that you'll generally have what is known as a client ID and a secret ID. A client ID you can think of almost like a username. It's not, but conceptually you can think of it like that. The secret is something you would never share. I'm sharing this on screen because this is test and I'll be tearing it all down. But basically the secret is almost like a password if you think of it like that. Now on top of that, when you're calling this token endpoint, you need to provide a grant type, and that normally is client credentials. And then in some instances, you need to provide a scope. And in this case, this is like the API endpoint. So this might seem quite confusing, but all you've got to bear in mind is when you're provided with access to an API, you'll be given all of this information. So now we've got that, what we can then do is do a post to the endpoint, and this should, in theory, give us a token in return. And there we go. So that was successful. And then what we've got is we've got a token type bearer. We've got the actual token, which is this gobbledygook here, as far as you're concerned. And then we've got some details on when it expires. Now, if you didn't have a valid secret, so we put something in here to make this invalid and hit send, you're going to get an error that's basically going to turn around and go, no, it's not right. You've not given the right details. So you'll either get a token or you won't. And then that token would, if it's set up correctly, give you access to that particular endpoint. And what you would do, if we go back to our new pet, you would then need to set this up under the authorization. So here you've got what is known as a bearer token. So we know when we've got our token back, it's type bearer. And generally when we're talking around tokens, that's what we mean. So if we select that, what we can then do is we can paste that token into here. And then you would do your standard request. So send that and you'd get your response back. If this token was invalid, it would fail. Now what we're actually doing is we're providing a token to an endpoint that's not expecting one. And it's not falling over because we're giving it more information than it requires. And that's the same with anything, generally speaking, with an API. If we decide to add in details here, like test Luke as a header and the details of test13 as the value and hitting send, generally speaking, that's not going to error. You're providing it with information and the API is just going to ignore it. It's not expecting it. However, if we're going to submit something, so we're going to try and get a GET request, and as part of that, we need to be able to provide a token. So we're going to provide the token value in here. If we provide an invalid or expired token and hit send, what we're going to get back, we're going to get unauthorized access. The token isn't valid. If it is valid, then like we've got on our standard pet store piece here, we'll get our response back. So when we're talking about using Postman, we need to ensure that we've got the correct root URL, which is in essence the endpoint. So for the pet store, it's up to v2. All of the bits afterwards are around what you're talking to. So if it was a WMS system, potentially it could be /orders or outbound orders /pre-advice /SKUs if you are then creating or getting or deleting SKUs. And then it's all around using the correct methods and ensuring that you provide the correct payload. And in all instances, when you're working with APIs, you will always be provided with some sort of document, whether it's a Swagger or whether the technical department just provides you with the raw information you need so you can populate the collection within Postman yourself. So they can provide you with the token endpoint, any secrets and that you need for your token. They can then provide you with any of the endpoint APIs you're using, and you'll then be able to use those with any payloads you're provided from the client, or if you've got some sort of internal system where you can pick up some examples and then paste those in on the body, and then you can do your testing around that. So that's really how we would use Postman in order to test. One thing you need to be aware of is the fact that you are basically talking to the API as if the client is. So if you're setting up an API for a customer, you can then get some credentials in order to get your token. You can then start talking to that API. If that API endpoint is live, you're talking to it live as if the customer is, in the same kind of way. So you need to be aware that what endpoint you're talking to, whether it's a test or a development API, whether it's a UAT or whether it's production. So you might have a customer, for instance, that submitted some data, something's happened on your end, and you can either get them to resubmit. They might turn around and go, that's not possible because they got, from their perspective, a 200 OK, but there's been some internal issue that's meant that hasn't been submitted. You can use Postman in order to point to the live API with the details that you have in order to submit that data. And that'll be submitted and accepted and processed as if it came from the client system. So you just got to think of Postman as like another user or another system that's then able to interact directly with that API. Thank you for joining me for this session. This is part of a Back to Basics mini-series where I'm looking at various systems, solutions, and concepts that are useful to understand when it comes to system integration. If there's anything else that you're interested in me covering as part of this series, please feel free to reach out or comment below. Thank you.